Two questions will determine the fate of the world in 2023. One, will there be a recession? Two, when will the war end? The answers to both questions depend importantly on what will happen to oil price. This is because 6 out of the last 8 US recessions were preceded by an oil price spike. Given the high dependency of the Russian economy on its oil and gas production, the level of energy price will determine Putin's staying power in the war. There are many drivers of oil price, but none is more important and less well understood than the role of dark tankers, a shadow fleet of ships that are helping Russia to invade Western sanctions. What are dark tankers? Which countries are involved? Why haven't the US cracked down on them? Will the spring Russian offensive force Biden's hand? How long would it take for the challengers to America's hegemonies to build an independent system for trading and transporting oil? What would this mean for inflation and your money? Hi, I'm David Wu, a former Wall Street strategist with a 20-year track record making actionable predictions about major global change. Welcome to The Money Game, where I take on groupthink, propaganda, and conspiracy theories in my critical analysis of markets, economics, and politics. Before we begin, please hit subscribe and the bell button so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Ami Daniel, who's the CEO and the founder of Windward, which is the world's leading company when it comes to AI platform, when it comes to shipping, intelligence. Windward counts among its clients some of the biggest intelligence agencies, some of the biggest oil companies, and some of the biggest regulators in the world. And there's nobody who's probably as informed as Ami about this issue of dark tankers right now. So Ami, thank you very much.
Good morning. It's great to be with you guys. And hi, David. Thanks for having me.
I mean, even before the sanctions, the latest sanctions from Europe, the price cap basically kicked in, already back in November, I seen one estimate that shows that, 30% of Russian oil was going to undisclosed location, undetermined location. Lloyd's List just published an article a few days ago saying that 35% of the large tankers, involved in transporting Russian oil are what they call dark fleet. What does that mean? What is the role of dark tankers?
So first of all, let's take a step back. Most of oil in the world is traded by ships, which means big tankers. Okay, there's about 4,000-ish crude oil tankers in the world trading currently. Every one of them can cost $50 million, $100 million, or $150 million. Broadly saying, sanctions is not a new thing. You had the US obviously do some sanctions, put on sanctions on Iran, on Venezuela, on DPRK. So sanctions aren't new, but the magnitude or the impact of sanctions in Russia is new, if that makes sense. Dark fleet is a term that emerged in the last 3 or 4 or 5 months, whereby there's an institutional country-level effort to create a fleet that can trade under the radar. So because the US has issued a cap guidance, which we'll talk about in a bit, I'm sure, and other sanctions, then it's hard to obtain insurance, to get into port, to buy fuel, to get tugs, if you're carrying Russian crude. The dark fleet is the guys who trade under the radar, are not covered by international insurance, or do not have what's called class society, which is kind of a global ISO-like stamp that you need to trade. So in 2022, there was a 470% increase of dark activities, vessels going dark to hide what they're doing, in the South Atlantic compared to 2021. There was almost a 150% increase in tanker ship-to-ship transfers in the Mid-Atlantic and a 130% increase in Greece. So obviously, these are a lot of stats that show you that people are hiding the origin of crude. People are trading Russian crude above the price cap, and they're getting away with it.
One of the reasons why the Russian oil's output has remained relatively stable throughout the sanctions is because they've been able to increase their export to China, to India, and Turkey. That have now pretty much replaced Europe, as the biggest destination of Russian oil export. And yet there are these dark tankers that are, supposedly transporting the oil to, undetermined location, right? If these countries, China, India, and Turkey, are already openly buying this crude, what's the problem basically just going public with buying more. I mean, what I'm trying to basically say is the so-called undetermined locations. Where are they going to?
We have seen a surge of about 54% of tankers coming from Russia into India and China. And I think that's notable. Where is all the rest of the oil going? It's a good question. I would bet my bucks they're going into countries which are not necessarily G7, EU, US, and not just China or India. And there's a lot of middle tier in that.
To me, what's interesting is that when I look at the actual Chinese oil import data last year, right? It was up like 20% last year, right? Relative to the year before, which is like, okay, I'm talking about, import from Russia. It was up, but it's not like up that much. Now, is it possible, yet you just said that, there was a 55% increase in tankers, carrying Russian oil to basically China. Is it possible that China is actually importing more oil from Russia than actually it's letting out? To the extent that it doesn't want to antagonize the Americans.
Absolutely, yes. I think China import data is notoriously unreliable, right? Everything in China is directed from above. So as far as I know, and I've seen this in many other industries, and that's also applicable to containerized goods and to dry bulk and to oil and CPP, absolutely, the Chinese government is known to take a good look at the statistics before it goes out. Interesting question is the petroleum reserves in China, because they're going to run out of space at some point. Because when oil is low, people want to buy a lot of oil and store it because the cost of storing it is not very high. So I think you can see that pool, but that pool can continue up to a certain amount. So Saudi, you haven't mentioned Saudi, but Saudi has been importing from Russia a lot. It makes more sense for Saudi right now to import from Russia and sell their own crude, because there's a 30% spread there, than refine their own crude. And it's a new phenomenon we haven't seen.
Presumably, you cannot put a name on basically a barrel of oil, right? A barrel of oil is barrel of oil. Of course, I mean, there are different types of oil and so on and so forth. Is it possible that dark tankers have been involved in shipping Russian oil, to Europe?
Yeah, so first of all, if you're a crude trader, you can absolutely 100% identify the molecules, okay? There is no chance in the world that the owner of the cargo cannot go to a lab and take a sample and not know the origin of the crude. Period, full stop. I actually don't believe there's Russian oil going into Europe. We see there's a dark fleet, 100, 200, 300 tankers, who knows, but that's about the amount. There's the white fleet, and then there's the gray fleet in the middle. And the gray fleet in the middle, I think, and we've seen this with Venezuela, if you're a Greek tanker operator with 3 vessels, you're not a brand, nobody knows you, you're not a big name, you might take deals with Venezuela or with Russia that make a lot of money, because you could make 10x the money, David. 10x the money on one voyage. 10x the money is a lot of money.
Give us a sense. I mean, how much does it cost to transport, let's just say basically a super tanker going from, the Russian, Baltic basically port to China? Okay. How much does it cost normally, and how much does it cost now?
Sure. So normally, so let's just a bit of terms, okay? So you would either use a VLCC to transport 2 million barrels, or an Aframax, it's called an Afra, to transport 1 million barrels. Historically, these were interchangeable. So the price of 2 Afras was the same as 1 VL. And then you could have said, I do these 2 or this one, it cost pretty much the same. But because Russia right now is under sanctions, you actually can't really have big vessels going into the deep ports. And because they need to go to deep ports themselves. It's like airplanes, like the Airbus A380, right? It needs a lot of infrastructure to go and trade somewhere or go to transport people to an airport. And these ships can't go into Europe because they're sanctioned. So then the demand for shipping, also called ton miles, and I'll just give the viewers an example here. If you transport 1 million tons for 1 mile, you do 1 million ton miles. So because this oil is not going into Europe anymore, but to China and India, then it's required to be transported longer distances. and then demand for ton miles has shot up the roof right now. Because the same amount of oil needs to go much longer journeys, right? It's like, it's a 35-day trip. It's not a 5-day trip, it's a 35-day trip. So what we're seeing is an anomaly in freight rates, and I'll give you some numbers. One of my customers last week in Greece, or the week prior, told me that they've chartered a vessel for an Aframax for $200,000 a day, just freight, right? That vessel would have gone for $40K a day a few months earlier. One deal for that shipping company I mentioned to you, $200,000 a day. Aframax, just to be clear, you're talking about $12 million of a deal per vessel. So if you are operating 100 vessels, $12 million a month, it's a big number.
Because to buy such a tanker, how much would it cost? Like $100 million?
$100 million, yeah.
So basically, it's like, well, you do 10 of these trips.
You make it back in 6-7 months, absolutely.
Incentive right now is so great that for people to cheat the system, it's absolutely overwhelming, especially given I understand, like the European Sanction Directive basically says, well, if you're caught in violation of the sanctions, you would be basically banned for only 3 months, which means, like, you know what? You could basically, if you make $12 million, you sit it out, you basically take a break for 3 months, it's still nothing.
I absolutely agree with you. That's why I said I think enforcement is the open question. It is completely unclear what would be the enforcement. I'll even give you a bigger example. The EU, I think in the 8th sanctions package, made the sanctions criminal. So that means you could be taken to prison theoretically, in Greece or Germany if you trade in Russian oil above the price cap. But no people have been taken to prison. From a trading perspective, a lot of people, I believe, will be making a lot of money due to these sanctions, and that's why I am not under the opinion this war is going to end. Because everybody's just making a lot of money. The Americans are making money because the Pentagon can sell, sell, somebody's paying, right? Taxpayer money. Weapons to Ukraine. Oil traders making money. Trafigura posted a $7 billion profit in 2022. $7 billion of profit, record year. And so I expect all the other traders to have the same record year because of the volatility. They're making money. Tanker operators are making money. You know, as you said, UAE, China, India, they're making money, right? Russia is still making money, my friend. So I wonder what's the interest in stopping all this.
And if you look at the oil majors, S&P 500 energy stocks were up 60% last year.
Of course.
By far the best performing sector in the world.
Of course.
Basically this war and the related sanctions is creating a racket. I mean, basically the victims here so far are basically the consumers, especially consumers in poor countries.
Absolutely.
Right? Poor people spend higher share of their income on energy, on transportation than rich people. So in the end, the war, especially the sanctions, all it's doing is impoverishing the poor in the world while basically making people a lot of rich money.
Why is the price cap at $60? If anybody wanted to suffocate Putin, he would put this at $30. And that's probably because they don't want to drive the world into recession, which is probably already there. By the way, I can tell you, and I'm not sure all the viewers know that, there's been a drop of approximately 30% in the container import to the US in Q4. 30%, right? Now, nobody knows if it's really 30% or it's like people have been front hauling their goods, but there are real indications already that the world is going into recession.
I think 2022 shows that the Russian economy was relatively insulated from the sanctions. And largely because, by the way, because Russia has a very strong, macro framework to the extent that prior to the sanctions, prior to the war, it was running a current account surplus and a budget surplus. I mean, very few countries in the world can boast of a twin surplus like Russia. As a result, they were able to basically weather the war. Now, however, again, this is why the sanctions is so important. If the sanctions start to really hurt Russia in terms of the prices it's able to realize for its export, then I think the Russian economy arguably longer term is going to have a problem. And it also raises question as to whether Putin, because we can sit here and say, well, who has the staying power? Right? I think, personally, I think, Putin does not have time on his side. This is why he needs to go on a major offensive. The only way he can actually send a strong message to the West to stop sending money to Ukraine is that there's no way Ukraine can win this war. And this is why, to me, the coming offensive is going to get very interesting. And I think it's going to come with a lot of basically force. Now, let me ask you a question. Let's imagine this happens, right? Because there's a big debate going on right now. When is the offensive going to happen? Now they just drafted 300,000 people.
Yeah.
There have been massive, basically, bombing of, Ukrainian
massive bombing,
right? Bombing. That's taking out their electricity, and then 60% of their trains run on basically electricity. So from that point of view,
we have employees in Ukraine. Some of them don't have heating.
Yeah, it's crazy. So from that point of view, it seems to me, I mean, as an Israeli, you were a naval officer before you founded basically UN war. I imagine they're doing this in order to soften the Ukrainian defense, in order to go on the major offensive. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to assume that they don't have an unlimited stockpile of artillery, ammunition, so on and so forth, right? So imagine this is actually, and by the way, it's very interesting. You remember, Xi Jinping and Putin spoke last week. It was actually, they were almost going to meet. It was very interesting because the last time, if you recall, was when Putin went to Beijing for the Olympic, and then a few weeks later, Russia invaded. Boom. I have to imagine if you're Putin, if you're going to do something like that, you want to let your most important partner know, right? And you want to consultations, so on and so forth. So imagine this what happens. Over the next basically 4 to 6 weeks, there's been a major Russian offensive, right? Do you think, in that kind of situation, we could see enforcement of the existing sanctions more aggressively?
Absolutely. I think if you're looking at the sanctions regimes, I think you're absolutely in the cards. You're seeing an expansion of sanctions on Russia from just oil. You have CPP coming. Absolutely, I think dry bulk is next up. So I think absolutely, if you judge according to the history of the Europeans and the US, you can see different sanctions packages escalate every time the war escalates. That's why they have the 9th sanctions package, because there's been 9 of them, right? So absolutely, indeed, if you're right, and I don't know if you're right or wrong, I suspect you are, by the way, and there will be an offensive. So absolutely, I see the sanctions, being expanded to dry bulk, which means grain, coal, iron ore, steel, which right now haven't been sanctioned, not just from Russia, but all the supply chain out of it, because again, steel is an end product. You need iron ore, you need coal. Russia is an export of coal. A lot of the what they've been doing is trading in the London Metals Exchange. So absolutely, I can see that. I could see sanctions enforcement actions.
In terms of the enforcement, right? There are a lot of ships that are supposedly carrying Russian oil that basically somewhere in the middle of their journey make a ship-to-ship transfer, right? That could be illegal. So far, nobody has actually checked out on them, right? Even though you have been able to geolocate them, you know exactly what happens, how long they're there.
Absolutely.
And then the intelligence agencies that have your platform, they know exactly what's going on. So why don't they basically send a ship or some kind of thing to basically check them out to see what's going on?
First of all,
is that possible?
I'm not privy to everything they do, but judging based on previous experience, I think the closest thing we have is Iran. So you did see the U.S. seize 4 or 5 vessels, I think, full of Iranian crude last year in the middle of the ocean, either in Greek waters or in Omani waters or in Emirati waters or international waters. So obviously they can do that when they want to. But that was also a political decision by the Biden administration to push Iran back into the JCPOA. So my assessment, knowing this world pretty well, is it's not the lack of intelligence, because as you mentioned, we're considered best in class. So if you're an intelligence agency and you sign up with Windward, you can monitor every vessel that's coming into your country. You know exactly what they've done before. You know exactly who owns them. If they turn off transmissions, you get an automatic red flag. You click twice and you get an optical imagery online on that vessel with that signature saying what they've done, right? So it makes the world very transparent and visible on a global scale in a way that hasn't been done before. And by the way, we had the first super major sign up to use our optical imagery in the platform in partnership with Planet Labs just the back end of last year. So we're seeing also the big traders and super majors adopt that level of technology as well. So I suspect it's not a matter of they don't have the intelligence. I suspect it's a matter of the decision makers not making yet the political decision to actually do that.
Right, because they're also afraid if they seize one ship, oil price is going to go up $10.
By the way, Israel, I think, has actually seen a benefit because thousands of millionaires and actually tens of thousands of very smart Russian people and Ukrainian people, but especially Russian people, have been fleeing mandatory drafting to the army into Israel. I actually have people I know who called me and said, listen, I've been on a business trip from Moscow to London with this trolley, and they told me I need to be drafted to the army, so I just took a plane to Israel. Can you help me get a credit card? So I think this has massive implication. I think Russia in the long term, you're talking about a brain drain. I think smart people don't see themselves long term right now in Russia. And capital and talent are right now highly mobile in the world. So as a country, as a society, you need to be very efficient and very attractive for people to stay there.
Biden went to Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman gave him the cold shoulder.
Sure.
Whereas like Xi Jinping was in basically Saudi Arabia, whatever, a few weeks ago, it was like rolling out the red carpet. Absolutely. We know that Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman wants to join the Shanghai Economic Cooperation Organization, of which China and Russia were the founding members. It seems that UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries are gravitating towards basically the Eurasia, economic zone, especially given the fact the U.S. is more or less energy independent. So they don't export very much to the U.S. anyway. On top of that, they don't feel like they can trust the U.S. when it comes to Iran. So in the end, I mean, if Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, India all basically create this one new basically zone trading oil, I mean, this is going to be like, they're just going to basically completely create a separate parallel universe in terms of oil trading or anything else trading for that matter.
Yeah, but I think it's the great decoupling, okay? And that's a much bigger issue, I think, right? Basically, and I think the Chinese people saw that coming. So when I was in ADIPEC, and I was listening very carefully to the Saudi Minister of Energy speaking, and to the CEO of ADNOC, was very thoughtful, and they said, and I quote, maximum energy security. They're talking about energy security.
U.S. has been a huge winner from the sanctions, right? I mean, if you think about this, right? If you look at it's actually pretty amazing just in the last 9 months since the war started, the U.S. trade deficit improved dramatically, while the combined trade balances of U.S. largest trading partners, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, massively deteriorated. In fact, the combined trade balance has gone to a massive deficit, all-time basically high. What this war has really done, the sanctions, U.S.-led sanctions, is that while it's reduced the dependency of U.S. allies on Russia, it's dramatically increased the dependency of these countries on the U.S.
Of course.
I mean,
which is successful. What do you mean? But that's also, by the way, the strategic criticism on the sanctions regime. That it's not about values, it's not about who's right, it's not about the Ukrainian people, it's about making money. And I'm not a cynicist, so I don't think that it's that extreme, but you can't overlook the consequence that at the end of the day, I think the big losers from all this is the EU, actually. Yeah. Because the EU has taken a hit in terms of oil prices, recession, import prices, trade partners.
Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, maybe even Iran or India, we're seeing the emergence of basically, this new alliance, which I call the multipolar world order, right? Because it's a fight between basically a unipolar world order versus a multipolar world order, right? So these guys who are all big enough to really have the ambition to become a power center, they decide to collaborate with and take on the US, and they see Europe as being basically a weak link in that equation anyway.
Absolutely.
Now, Russia already has 100 basically tankers.
Yep.
They're probably going to be adding more, and with Saudi Arabia, China, India, they have their own tankers, presumably, and very soon.
Yeah, Saudi has Bakhi. Bakhi has 220 tankers. Yeah.
Exactly. So from that point of view, at what point, how long would it take for these countries to be able to really build out a totally independent, self-sufficient, basically transportation for the world's oil?
Years.
Years?
Not months. Years. Yeah, because.
How many years we're talking about?
The question, it's a complicated question because the question is, it takes 3 or 4 years to build a ship. So you can't really build 200 ships like it's all overbooked basically. Probably 3 to 5 years, that's my guess.
3 to 5 years.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's my guess. Which, by the way, from a strategic, if you take the Chinese perspective, democracy don't have to get reelected.
Yeah.
So they can take a long-term perspective, and in that sense, I would expect they've already put in plan to execute on building a fully sufficient. So if I were the Chinese or the Russian Ministry of Transport, I would tell them, guys, here's like $5 billion, here's $10 billion over the next 5 years. Your goal is to make a self-sufficient trading, shipping ecosystem that is not completely independent of the West,
Yeah.
which they haven't done so far. But I expect they will do.
A lot of the world's tankers are, basically owned by the Norwegians, by the Greeks. All the reinsurers, the insurance companies are British, Swiss, and German.
Yeah.
Literally, that business, which is a very profitable business. How big is that business, by the way? It's a big business. The Chinese and the Russian and the Indians can take a very big part of that business. And right now, they're paying customers to these businesses.
Yeah,
they might decide to basically run these own business themselves.
Yeah, listen, Russia has Sovcomflot, which was a proper operation pre-war. So Sovcomflot and BP, for instance, had a bunch of joint ventures.
Yes.
It was a proper, high-class, very good shipping company. Beyond Sovcomflot, you have really, China has Costco. So China, knows how to operate container companies and tanker companies and so forth. So they have the know-how and the ambition, the execution to do so. The UAE has ADNOC. ADNOC has 300 vessels now. So all these people know how to operate fleets. I think the problem is not just to buy vessels, it's also the insurance and the reinsurance and the financing is, I think, the soft spot, because the way marine reinsurance works, it comes into play only in oil spills. What happens if you have an oil spill, right? Do you get sued for billions? Who reprimands that? Who gives you the know-how for that? What do you do not just for direct insurance, but for reinsurance? It's a very complex, hyper-specialized world. Actually, you have 20, maybe 15 marine reinsurance companies. So it's not easy to replicate. So I think long-term, that's a very complicated area. All the oil and the cargoes you see on the seas are all financed. The trade finance industry, which takes about a 1.5% of interest per month, which is very profitable, obviously, is dependent upon what's called correspondent banking, which means, let's say I have a bank, and that's just a bank, and you have a bank, it's a bank. We might use Citibank in the middle as a correspondent bank because our banks don't have a relationship. So Citibank and Societe Generale and Bank of America and all these guys are all material and instrumental in being able to trade across the seas. And that's also hard to replicate because you need correspondent banking. So it's not just buying ships, and I think it's an oversimplification of the challenge.
Europe, especially, now has the import of liquid natural gas. And then obviously transporting liquid natural gas using tanker is much more expensive than getting natural gas through pipeline. Sure. Talk to us a little bit about the costs, and then what does that mean for the Mediterranean suppliers, North Africa, Israel, Qatar, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think it creates a lot of opportunity for all these guys. So I think Israel has just done, in the last couple of months, the first contracts ever to export natural gas into Europe. That wasn't even an opportunity for Israel.
"2022 has been about the disengagement between the two worlds. The two economic superpowers in the world, U.S. versus China. You can look at Russia as being the little cousin of basically China, but that's the real big story here. And so we're now going to see basically development of parallel technology system, trading system, payment system, you name it, and even oil transport system. I think, in my view, two is going to be more expensive than one.
Absolutely.
So from that point of view, this whole inflation shock that we went through in 2022 seems to me is going to be here to stay. Wouldn't you say that at least in energy, when it comes to transportation, that cost is going to be permanently higher as a result of this?
I think in the next, I wouldn't say permanent because, if there's a regime change in Russia and there's a reprimands and nothing is permanent in the world, never say never.
Yes.
But I think absolutely, as I look into 2023, I see demand for consumer goods remaining as low as it is right now. So absolutely, we see, we and everybody we speak to do not see an uptick in the global economy in 2023, maybe in Q1, Q2, 2024. In the transport perspective, absolutely the freight costs will remain or even rise. Although some people have said to me that they already think that the freight hikes for CPP for Feb 6 are already built in the deals right now. So I think as these sanctions, if indeed Russia will go into an offensive, as you think, and these sanctions expand the dry bulk, I would see actually that suffering as well, and freight costs going there as well, higher than it is right now, and actually the cost of the goods, and therefore the impact on the consumer becoming just becoming bigger and harsher. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Armin. This is really, really, really helpful, and I'm sure our audience would have gotten a lot out of this interview.
Thanks
Thank
for
you very
having
much.
me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.